Chapter 9. Lecture. The Origins of Genetics. Mendel and the Garden Pea Experiment.
I'd like to begin today's lecture by asking a few simple questions. Why do people look different from cats, from horses, and from birds? Why do people look different from each other? Why do you look different from your sister or brother? The answer to all these questions lies in the genes of people and animals. Your genes provide biological instructions that control how you look, how you function, and even partly how you behave. Genes determine how every living creature on Earth appears, functions, reproduces, and generally behaves. Now, genes are found inside the cells of the body. They're made up of deoxyribonucleic acid, or as we always call it, DNA. DNA contains instructions for what each of the genes is supposed to do. These genes are passed down from one generation to the next, or inherited. You may, for example, have inherited the color of your hair from your mother, or the ability to roll your tongue from your father, or maybe you inherited some other interesting trait you may or may not be grateful for from your great-great-great-grandfather or grandmother. Who knows? Inherited traits or characteristics are determined by combinations of genes that are different for every human being. Now, although each individual is unique, it's interesting to note that most genes are common to every person on Earth. In fact, humans share many of the same genes with other kinds or species of animals, from the simple little fruit fly to our close cousins, the apes. In fact, and this might surprise you, humans and the small African ape called the bonobo share about 97% of the same genes. I don't know whether that's good news or not for us, or for the bonobos. The study of genes is a branch of the field of biology called genetics, and the scientists who study how genes are inherited and passed from one generation to the next are called geneticists. The field of genetics actually dates back to the mid-1800s, but most of what we know today about genes, and also about genetic disorders, has been learned in only the last few decades. But I don't want to jump ahead to what's going on in modern genetics before we acknowledge and briefly examine the work of a pioneer in biology, Gregor Mendel. Mendel lived from 1822 to 1884. He carried out some of the earliest experiments in genetics by studying the simple pea plant. Now, between 1856 and 1863, Mendel grew more than 28,000 pea plants, and he kept very careful records on these plants. From these records, he saw clearly that there was a predictable pattern by which plant traits or characteristics were passed from one generation of pea plant to the next, a pattern that had never been reported before. Mendel explained the patterns in principles, or laws. Today, these principles are known as the Mendelian laws of heredity. Because we're talking about Gregor Mendel, let me take a moment to tell you something interesting about him that might help you see the real man. Now, in 1843, Mendel joined an order of monks that had strong interests in science and culture, and he became a teacher. In 1851, he was sent to the University of Vienna to study mathematics and experimental biology, the two subjects that were to make him so famous throughout the world. After 2 years of study, he left the University of Vienna to return to the monastery and to teaching. Mendel was extremely nervous and anxious about taking exams. It seems that this extreme nervousness about taking examinations kept him from taking the exam to be certified to continue teaching. Instead, when he returned to his monastery, Mendel began conducting his research and became one of the most famous scientists of all time. All right, let's see, where was I? Oh, yes. I was talking about genes and the passing of certain traits and characteristics from one generation to another. Many of your individual traits resemble those of your parents, including the color and shape of your eyes, the texture of your hair, and even your height and weight. Your parents have passed traits on to you, and this passing of traits from parent to offspring, as we know, is called heredity. From the earliest times, people have been interested in studying and understanding how heredity works. People have wanted to learn how they could alter crop plants, like corn, to give the corn traits that would make the corn crop larger and better tasting. And today, farmers can do that. Humans have also always been interested in learning how to improve the breeding of animals to make them more valuable and useful. Let's see. In the case of racehorses, for example, owners want to breed strong, beautiful, and fast horses that can run faster than their competitors' horses. A famous racehorse, Seabiscuit, was the grandson of a champion racehorse named Man of War. Undoubtedly, Man of War passed on traits of strength and speed that helped his grandson, Seabiscuit, race faster than so many other horses, even though Seabiscuit was a small horse compared to the larger horses he raced against. Okay, well, to continue, before DNA was discovered, that is, when Gregor Mendel began his experiments, heredity was one of the greatest mysteries of science. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Mendel studied science at the University of Vienna, and there he learned how to use mathematics to try to explain natural phenomena. While in Vienna, Mendel studied the work of Thomas Knight, another early pioneer in the study of heredity and genetics. Knight had crossed a variety of garden pea that had violet flowers with a variety that had white flowers. To his surprise, he found that all of the offspring had only violet flowers. However, when two of the violet-flowered offspring were crossed, their offspring produced both violet and white flowers. The white color trait had reappeared in the second generation of the plant. Knight was puzzled by this reappearance of the white flowers in the second generation, and he was unable to explain why this happened. Mendel decided to repeat Knight's work on the garden pea plant, which is called Pisum sativum in Latin. But Mendel decided to apply his knowledge of mathematics and statistics to help him predict the results of the crossbreeding of the white-flowering and violet-flowering plants. Okay, now, you might ask why Mendel used a plant rather than an animal to study the puzzle of heredity, and why he used the simple garden pea rather than a rose or some other flowering plant. Well, Mendel had a number of good reasons for choosing to study the pea plant. For one thing, this plant was readily available and plentiful where he lived in Austria. Second, the peas could be cultivated quickly and with little effort. And most important, from a mathematician's perspective, the garden pea plant produced a large number of baby pea plants, or offspring. Actually, it seems that the garden pea was a very good subject for studying heredity for several other reasons as well. The garden pea plant has many traits that have two clearly different forms that are easy to tell apart, such as color. The color of a pea flower is either violet or white. There is no intermediate color. Now, next, the mating of the garden pea flowers can be easily manipulated, so Mendel was able to control the mating of the plant easily and then observe the offspring plants that resulted from the mating. As I mentioned at the beginning of the lecture, Mendel grew more than 28,000 plants and recorded the many offspring of these plants. And he did all this counting and record-keeping long before computers were available for record-keeping and statistical analysis. Pretty impressive. We're still benefiting today from the early research done by Gregor Mendel, As a result of his research, today we understand much more about genetics and heredity, though there is still so much more to be learned. We now know that genes are tiny biochemical structures inside each cell. They determine particular hereditary traits, such as eye color, blood type, height, and so on. But we must remember that the gene gives only the potential for the development of a particular trait. How this potential is realized or achieved depends partly on the interaction of the gene with other genes, and it depends partly on the environment. For example, a person may have a genetic tendency to be overweight, but the person's actual weight will also be influenced by a number of environmental factors, such as how much and what kinds of food the person eats, and how much exercise the person gets. Yes, we are what we eat, and thanks to the fact that our ancestors ate, we are. And on that note, my inherited hunger trait is telling me it's almost time for lunch, so we'll stop there.